What if I told you that America lost an entire industry without firing a single shot? Most people heard the headlines about tariffs and trade wars, but very few grasped what was happening beneath the surface. While Washington celebrated its tough stance on Brazil, something extraordinary was unfolding just north of the border. A country that doesn't grow a single coffee bean had quietly stepped into America's place as the hemisphere's coffee hub. But here's what nobody expected. This wasn't just about coffee. It was about the fragility of American economic dominance in an era where reliability trumps raw power. Let me take you inside the room where this decision was made, because what you're about to discover will change how you see global trade forever. Picture this. It's a cold Tuesday morning in Washington, 2024. Trade officials are celebrating what they believe will be a slam-dunk victory over Brazil. The logic seemed bulletproof. Impose a steep tariff, force Brazil to negotiate, maintain American leverage. Simple, right? But there were three signs everyone missed. First, Brazil had been quietly diversifying its export routes for months. Second, Canadian ports had been expanding their capacity specifically for South American imports. And third, the third sign is what explains everything that happened next. Brazil's response wasn't dramatic submission. It was something far more devastating to American interests: quiet redirection. Here's where the story gets fascinating. While American importers scrambled to adjust to doubled coffee prices, Brazilian exporters were already finalizing agreements with a northern neighbor that had done nothing more provocative than keep its word. Canada never announced it would seize America's coffee market. It simply maintained what Washington had abandoned: predictability. Now, let me introduce you to Maria Santos, a third-generation coffee exporter from São Paulo. For 30 years, her family's cooperative had shipped to the same American importers, building relationships that seemed unshakable. But when the tariff hit, her phone started ringing with a different kind of call. Not from panicked American buyers, but from Canadian traders offering something her American partners never had: long-term price stability. The Canadians weren't offering charity, Maria explained. They were offering partnership. They understood that sustainable coffee relationships require sustainable economics. The mechanics of this shift reveal everything about how modern power actually works. When the U.S. imposed its tariff, it wasn't just changing a price point. It was signaling something profound about American reliability as a trading partner. And institutions, whether governments or corporations, have long memories. Brazil faced a choice: absorb the financial hit and hope for American policy stability, or diversify toward partners who treated commerce as cooperation rather than coercion. The decision was rational, not emotional. But here's what caught everyone off guard: the speed of the transformation. Within weeks, ships that had routinely docked in Miami and New York were heading to Vancouver and Montreal instead. American coffee importers, stunned by overnight cost increases, watched helplessly as their supply chains evaporated. Meanwhile, Canadian importers were signing long-term contracts that offered exactly what Brazil needed most: predictability. David Chen, a fourth-generation coffee importer from New Orleans, watched his century-old family business shrink from 47 employees to 22. My Brazilian suppliers had to make a choice, he said: honor relationships with Americans who might change the rules again tomorrow, or build new partnerships with Canadians who promise stability. The human dimension of this story matters more than statistics. Behind every abstract term like supply chain disruption are real people. Dock workers whose shifts disappeared, small cafe owners whose margins evaporated, families whose livelihoods depended on the steady flow of green coffee beans through American ports. But while turbulence radiated across American coffee communities, Canadian workers were gaining opportunities. Sarah McKinnon, a logistics coordinator at the Port of Vancouver, saw her department triple in size. Once Brazilian exporters discovered they could count on our consistency, word spread, she observed. Other South American countries started inquiring. We went from being a regional player to a hemispheric gateway. This is where George Will's deeper institutional insight becomes crucial. What we witnessed wasn't just market reallocation. It was a demonstration of how trust functions in global economics. When a superpower treats predictability as expendable, it discovers that size alone cannot compel loyalty. The ripple effects extended far beyond coffee. European importers took note. Asian buyers began hedging their own American dependencies. When a nation demonstrates that it's willing to disrupt foundational trade relationships for short-term political theater, partners worldwide begin preparing for a future where American stability can no longer be assumed. Coffee might seem like a specialty commodity, but it's actually one of the most globally traded products after oil and steel. When the coffee supply chain reorganizes, it sends signals about broader institutional reliability that reach into sectors far beyond agriculture. This brings us to the overlooked twist that reveals everything about 21st century economic power. Traditional thinking assumes that leverage flows from the largest player to smaller ones, but in interconnected markets, volatility punishes the volatile actor most severely. American businesses dependent on Brazilian coffee couldn't simply find domestic alternatives. Coffee doesn't grow in Kansas. The specialized infrastructure, decades-old relationships, and accumulated expertise built around Brazilian imports couldn't be replicated overnight. So while policymakers celebrated their tough stance, American companies absorbed the real costs. The numbers tell the story starkly. Before the tariff, the U.S. processed roughly 67% of Brazil's coffee exports. Today, that figure has dropped to 38%. Canada, which previously handled less than 8%, now processes 24%. Canada discovered something that nations often overlook. Reliability itself is a competitive advantage. In a world rattled by unpredictable political cycles, steadiness becomes magnetic. Foreign investors noticed. Other South American exporters inquired about Canadian partnerships. What began as coffee market redirection evolved into broader economic realignment. The institutional memory of markets is longer than the memory of politicians. Once supply chains reorganize around new patterns, they rarely return to old loyalties. Brazil found that Canadian partnerships offered not just stable pricing, but long-term planning horizons that volatile American politics couldn't match. This creates what economists call a stickiness effect. When businesses invest in new supply chain relationships, reverting to old patterns becomes economically irrational even if political circumstances change. Maria Santos's cooperative now has Portuguese language customer service for Canadian buyers and shipping protocols optimized for Pacific routes. Even if the U.S. eliminated its coffee tariff tomorrow, the switching costs would make returning financially dubious. This is where we see the true cost of treating trade relationships as temporary arrangements rather than institutional commitments. Every time American policy signals that established partnerships can be reshuffled for domestic political advantage, international partners adjust their strategies accordingly. The coffee collapse illustrates a broader principle. In global economics, power increasingly belongs not to those who demand compliance, but to those who inspire confidence. Canada never threatened anyone, never issued ultimatums, never weaponized its trade policy. It simply remained steady while others chose chaos. For American consumers, the consequences arrived quietly but persistently. The average price of coffee in American supermarkets has risen by 37% since the tariff implementation. Independent coffee shops, unable to absorb increased costs, have closed at rates not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. Meanwhile, Canadian consumers enjoyed stable coffee prices and reliable supply, benefits of their government's decision to treat trade partnerships as long-term commitments rather than short-term negotiations. The broader lesson extends beyond coffee or even trade policy. In an era where global relationships are increasingly fluid, nations that project institutional stability gain influence in ways that traditional measures of power cannot capture. Military strength and economic size remain important, but they're insufficient when partners lose confidence in a nation's commitment to its own agreements. What we witnessed was not Brazil punishing America, but Brazil protecting itself from American unpredictability. The distinction matters because it reveals how defensive actions can become competitive advantages in today's interconnected world. Canada's coffee market success story is really a story about institutional temperament. While others oscillated between aggression and accommodation, Canada chose consistency. That choice, multiplied across hundreds of trade relationships and thousands of business decisions, compounds into something resembling quiet leadership. The final irony is perhaps the most instructive. American policymakers sought to demonstrate strength through economic pressure, but strength in the 21st century flows toward those who prove they can be trusted with other nations' prosperity. By treating trade as a lever rather than a partnership, the U.S. inadvertently taught its partners to depend less on American reliability. Today, when you lift that morning cup of coffee to your lips, you're tasting the consequences of choices made in distant capitals by officials who probably never imagined their decisions would reshape something as fundamental as your daily ritual. But that's how modern power works, quietly, persistently, through the accumulation of trust or its erosion. The coffee market didn't collapse because America lacked economic strength. It collapsed because America demonstrated that strength without stability is no longer sufficient to command the loyalty of global partners. Canada simply offered an alternative: competence without drama, reliability without dominance. In the end, the nation that chose predictability over power plays became the unexpected victor in a competition it never announced it was entering.